"Leave our land," Clara Whitlock said, her voice low but cutting clean through the dry wind like a blade that didn't need to be seen to be felt. And Ethan Cole didn't answer right away. He just stood there with the sun dropping behind his shoulders, dust clinging to his coat, eyes scanning the stretch of open ground like a man measuring something no map could hold. Then slowly, deliberately, he stepped past her and drove a wooden stake into the earth with a dull, final thud, as if the decision had already been made long before he ever rode into this valley. Clara didn't move at first, didn't reach for the gun at her side, because this wasn't about fear, it was about memory, about the way the land held voices long after the people were gone, and she had spent years listening to them, guarding what little was left from men who saw nothing but empty acres and profit. Ethan's horse shifted behind him, leather creaking softly, the smell of sun-warmed dust and iron filling the quiet. Between them, "You don't understand what you're standing on," she said, quieter now, not a warning, but something closer to a truth offered once and never again. Ethan adjusted his grip on the hammer, his hands rough, steady, the kind that had built and buried more than they ever spoke about. "I understand enough," he said, and his voice wasn't hard, wasn't challenging, just tired in a way that came from too many roads and not enough places to stop. Clara's eyes narrowed slightly, studying him. "Not the way you look at a threat, but the way you try to decide if something is worth the cost of letting it stay." The wind picked up, dragging loose strands of her hair across her face, carrying with it the faint scent of sage and something older, something buried deeper than roots. Ethan moved again, setting another stake, each strike echoing across the open land like a heartbeat that refused to slow. He wasn't rushing, wasn't trying to prove anything, just building, piece by piece, as if patience itself was the only argument he trusted. Clara turned away then, not in surrender, but in calculation, her boots pressing into the dry soil as she walked the perimeter he was claiming without asking, her gaze catching on the small, uneven rise just beyond where he stood, a place most men would miss, but not her, never her. She stopped there for a moment, her hand brushing lightly over the ground, and for the first time, there was something in her expression that wasn't defiance, but something heavier, something that carried names without speaking them. Behind her, Ethan paused, watching, not stepping closer, not asking, just waiting in that quiet way that said he understood boundaries even as he crossed them. The sun dipped lower, stretching their shadows long across the land. Two figures standing on opposite sides of something neither of them was willing to leave behind. And somewhere in that silence, the first crack in the distance rolled across the hills, not loud, not close, but enough to remind them both that this land was never as empty as it seemed, and that staying here would cost more than either of them had said out loud. The wind did not settle after the sound rolled across the hills. It lingered, carrying that distant echo like a warning that refused to fade, and Ethan Cole stood still for a moment longer than before, his hand resting on the top of the last stake he had driven into the ground, his eyes tracing the horizon where the land dipped and rose again in quiet waves, as if he was listening for something that had not yet decided to show itself. Clara Whitlock watched him from the slight rise, her posture unchanged, but something in her gaze had shifted, not softer, not kinder, just more certain, as if a question she had been holding onto no longer needed asking. "You heard that," she said finally, her voice carrying across the open space without effort. Ethan did not turn immediately. He adjusted the brim of his hat, letting the fading light fall across his face in uneven lines. "I hear a lot of things out here," he replied, calm, measured, like a man who had learned not to chase every sound. Clara stepped down from the rise, her boots pressing into the dry soil with quiet intention, stopping just short of the boundary he had marked, her eyes dropping briefly to the line of stakes, each one placed with care, not rushed, not careless. "Most men would pack up," she said, not accusing, not advising, just stating what she had seen too many times before. Ethan gave a faint shake of his head, almost to himself. "Most men still have somewhere else to go," he said, and there was no weight in the words, no plea, just a simple truth that hung in the air between them. Clara studied him again, longer this time, as if trying to find the edge of him, the part that would break or bend under pressure. But there was nothing obvious, no anger, no pride, just a quiet steadiness that made him harder to read than any threat she had faced before. The light continued to fall, stretching shadows until they blurred together across the ground, and for a brief moment, it looked as though there was no line between where he stood and where she guarded, just open land caught between two people who refused to leave it behind. Ethan moved toward his horse, loosening the straps with practiced hands, checking each buckle as if the routine itself mattered more than the result. Clara turned slightly, her gaze shifting back toward the distant ridge, her fingers brushing against the worn fabric of her sleeve where the wind had thinned it over time. "They will come closer," she said, quieter now, not directed at him as much as to the land itself. Ethan paused, his hand resting against the saddle. "Then I will still be here," he answered, simple, final. And something in the way he said it made the space between them feel smaller, not safer, but more certain. Clara let out a slow breath she did not realize she had been holding, her eyes moving once more to the ground just beyond his line, to the place most would overlook, and for a moment, she almost spoke again, almost told him what rested beneath that soil, what names the wind still carried when the nights grew too still, but the words did not come, not yet. Instead she stepped back, just one pace, enough to place herself outside the line he had drawn, not retreating, not yielding, just choosing her ground as carefully as he had chosen his. And as the last of the lights slipped behind the hills, the silence returned, heavier now, filled with everything neither of them had said, and somewhere beyond the ridge, the echo came again, closer this time, not louder, but clearer, like something finding its way back. The night came down slow and heavy, the kind that settled into the bones and made every sound feel closer than it should be. And Ethan Cole sat by a small fire that barely pushed back the dark, his hands resting on his knees, eyes fixed on the low flames as if they were telling him something worth hearing. The horses shifted now and then behind him, leather creaking, breath visible in the cooling air, but he did not turn. He had already learned the rhythm of this place, the way it held still, until it decided not to. Across the faint line of stakes, Clara Whitlock remained where she had chosen to stand, not watching him directly, but aware of every movement he made, her silhouette framed against the dim outline of the land she guarded. The wind carried the scent of smoke and dry grass, weaving it through the silence like a thread that refused to break. "You build a fire like you plan to stay," she said after a long stretch of quiet, her voice lower now, shaped by the dark instead of the sun. Ethan glanced up briefly, not startled, just acknowledging her presence without giving it weight. "I build it so the night does not forget I am here," he answered, and there was something in the way he said it that did not ask for agreement. Only space. Clara stepped closer then, just enough for the firelight to touch her face, revealing the lines that time and weather had carved there, not old, but worn in a way that came from carrying more than one life should. Her eyes flicked to the ground beyond his camp, to that same quiet rise that had held her attention earlier, and for a moment, she hesitated, not from fear, but from the weight of speaking something that could not be taken back. "You chose the wrong place to stop," she said, not sharp, not accusing, just certain. Ethan followed her gaze this time, really looking at the land instead of measuring it, his eyes narrowing slightly as if trying to read what she saw so clearly. "Land is land," he said, but softer now, less certain than before. Clara shook her head once, slow, deliberate. "Not this one," she replied, and the fire shifted with a quiet crack, sending a brief glow across the ground between them. Ethan leaned forward slightly, picking up a small piece of wood and setting it into the flames with care, not feeding the fire, just maintaining it, like he understood the difference between keeping something alive and letting it take over. "Then tell me what makes it different," he said, not challenging, just asking. And that alone changed something in the air. Clara looked at him then, really looked, searching for the part of him that would turn this into something it did not need to be. But she did not find it. Only that same quiet patience that had unsettled her from the beginning. The wind picked up again, brushing past them both, and she drew a slow breath before speaking. "There are people buried out there," she said, her voice barely above the sound of the fire. "Not marked, not remembered by anyone who still breathes. But they are there, and I made sure no one builds over them." Ethan did not respond right away, his gaze returning to the faint rise. the shape of it clearer now that he knew what to look for. The silence stretched, not empty, but full of something shifting beneath the surface. "You guard graves," he said finally, and there was no disbelief in it. Only recognition. Clara nodded once, her posture steady. "Someone has to," she answered, and the words settled between them like something final. Ethan exhaled slowly, his shoulders easing. Just a fraction, not in defeat, but in understanding that had come too late to change what he had already done. And somewhere beyond the ridge, that distant sound came again, closer now, threading through the dark like a reminder that the land was about to be tested in ways neither of them could ignore. The fire burned lower as the night stretched deeper, its glow now a quiet pulse against the vast dark, and Ethan Cole remained seated, his gaze fixed not on the flames anymore, but on that small rise Clara had pointed to, the ground that no longer felt like empty land but something heavier, something claimed long before he ever arrived. The wind moved slower now, colder, brushing past the stakes he had driven earlier, each one standing straight, certain, like they did not yet understand what they marked. Clara Whitlock did not step away after speaking. She stayed where she was, just beyond the edge of his camp, her presence no longer a warning but not yet an invitation either. "You should pull those out before morning," she said after a long silence, her voice steady, not urgent, but carrying a weight that came from knowing what followed when people did not listen. Ethan leaned forward, resting his forearms on his knees, his hands loosely clasped, as if he was holding on to a thought he had not yet decided to act on. "Morning is a long way off," he replied, quiet, not dismissive, just buying time in the only way he knew how. Clara's eyes shifted toward the horizon, even though there was nothing to see yet, just darkness layered over more darkness. "Not as long as you think," she said. And this time there was something different beneath the words, not fear, but certainty, sharpened by experience. Ethan followed her gaze again, and for the first time since he had arrived, there was a flicker of hesitation in him, small, almost invisible, but real, like a man realizing the ground beneath his feet was not as simple as it looked. The horses shifted again, more restless now, their ears turning toward the same distant direction, picking up something neither of them could fully hear yet. Ethan rose slowly to his feet, not in alarm, but in recognition that sitting still would not answer what was coming. He stepped past the edge of the firelight, his boots pressing into the cool dirt as he walked toward the line of stakes, stopping at the first one he had driven, his hand hovering over it for a moment before resting lightly against the rough wood. Clara watched him closely, not moving, not speaking, waiting to see which way he would lean, toward staying or toward understanding. The wind shifted again, carrying with it a faint rhythm now, something steady, something that did not belong to the land itself. Ethan closed his eyes briefly, not to escape it, but to hear it better, and when he opened them again, there was no denial left in his expression, only a quiet acceptance that whatever was approaching would not be turned away by silence or stubbornness alone. "You knew they would come," he said, not accusing, just stating what had become clear. Clara nodded once, her posture unchanged. "I knew someone would," she answered, and the space between them tightened, not with tension, but with a shared understanding that had not been there before. Ethan looked down at the stake again, the line it represented, the choice it marked, and for a moment, it seemed like he might pull it free, like he might undo the boundary he had drawn without asking. But his hand did not move, not yet. Instead, he stepped back, letting the wood stand where it was, unfinished, unresolved, like the decision itself. The sound in the distance grew clearer now, not louder, but closer, steady enough that even the wind could not hide it anymore. Clara shifted her weight slightly, her eyes still fixed on that unseen line beyond the hills. "When they arrive," she said quietly, "they will not ask whose side you are on." Ethan let out a slow breath, his gaze lifting from the ground to meet hers for the first time since the fire had burned low. "Then I guess it is a good thing I already know," he said. And though he did not move closer to her, something in the way he stood had changed, not claiming the land, not leaving it, but standing with it. And in the distance, the rhythm continued to approach, steady, patient, like something that had all the time in the world to reach them. The rhythm did not stop at the edge of the hills. It kept coming, steady and unhurried, like it already knew where it was going. and Ethan Cole stood beside the line of stakes he had driven into the ground, his shadow stretching long across the dirt as the fire behind him faded to embers, his hand no longer hovering, no longer uncertain, just resting at his side as if the choice had already settled somewhere deeper than thought. Clara Whitlock did not move from her place, but her eyes followed the dark horizon with a focus that came from years of watching things arrive before others even noticed they were on their way. The horses shifted again, more restless now, their hooves pressing into the earth in uneven patterns, their breath sharp in the cooling air, and Ethan reached back without looking, his hand finding the reins, steadying them with a quiet touch that carried no panic, only presence. "They are closer than before," Clara said, her voice low, shaped by the night and the distance closing in. Ethan nodded once, not because he needed to be told, but because he could feel it now, not just hear it. Something moving through the land with purpose, something that did not belong to chance. He stepped forward then, past the first stake, crossing the line he had drawn as if it no longer mattered which side he stood on, his boots pressing into the soil near the small rise Clara had shown him, the place that held more than it revealed. He stopped there, looking down, really looking, the ground uneven in a way that was not natural, subtle, but enough for a man who paid attention, and he removed his hat slowly, not as a gesture for anyone watching, but for what lay beneath. Clara saw it and did not speak, because that one action told her more than any promise could. The wind shifted again, carrying that steady rhythm closer, clearer, and now there was no mistaking it. Not thunder, not chance, but riders, or something like them, moving with direction. Ethan replaced his hat, turning back toward the line of stakes, his eyes tracing them one by one, each piece of wood marking a claim he had made without knowing what it cost. He walked back to the first one, his hand closing around it firmly this time, and for a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath, Clara's gaze fixed on him, waiting, not urging, not hoping, just watching the man decide who he was going to be when it mattered. Ethan pulled, slow, deliberate, the wood resisting for a second before giving way, the sound of it leaving the earth quiet but final, and he did not stop there. He moved to the next, and the next, each one coming free with the same steady motion, not rushed, not dramatic, just undone, piece by piece, until the line was no longer a boundary, just scattered wood against the ground. Clara exhaled slowly, something in her shoulders easing that had been tight for longer than she could remember, but she did not thank him, did not speak, because this was not about her. It was about what he chose without being asked again. The rhythm in the distance did not slow, but something about it changed, not in sound, but in weight, as if the land itself had noticed the shift. Ethan gathered the last stake in his hand and turned back toward the rise, planting it gently into the ground beside it, not as a claim, but as a marker, a quiet acknowledgement of what rested there. And then he stepped back, standing beside Clara now, not ahead, not behind, just there, facing the same horizon. And when the shapes finally began to form in the distance, still far, still silent, there was no question left between them about where he stood. The figures on the horizon did not rush. They moved with a patience that made them harder to read, dark shapes against the thinning night, their presence pressing into the land long before they ever reached it. And Ethan Cole stood beside Clara Whitlock without shifting, his posture steady, his eyes fixed forward as if he had already accepted whatever would come from that direction. The small marker he had placed near the rise stood quiet behind him, catching the faintest trace of moonlight. Not a claim, not a defense, just a sign that something there mattered. The wind carried less dust now, the air cooler, cleaner, like the land itself had taken a breath and was waiting to see what would follow. Clara's hands rested loosely at her sides, not near her weapon, not tense, just ready in the way someone becomes after too many years of standing ground that no one else sees. "They are not here for you," she said quietly, her voice even, measured, not offering comfort, just truth. Ethan nodded once, his gaze not leaving the approaching line. "They are not here for you either," he replied, and there was no challenge in it, only recognition that whatever was coming did not belong to either of them alone. The shapes grew clearer as they drew closer, not yet faces, not yet details, but enough to see the formation, deliberate, controlled, nothing wasted, nothing hurried. Ethan shifted his weight slightly. Not stepping forward, not stepping back, just adjusting to the moment as it unfolded, his hand brushing briefly against his coat before falling still again. Clara noticed the movement, but said nothing, because it was not the kind of motion that led to trouble. It was the kind that meant a man was preparing to stand still when it mattered most. The distance closed slowly, the rhythm of their approach now unmistakable, steady like a heartbeat that had found its pace, and the silence between Ethan and Clara deepened, not empty, but filled with everything that had already been decided without words. Most men would have left by now, Clara said after a while, her eyes still forward, her tone unchanged. Ethan let out a faint breath that almost passed for a quiet laugh, though there was no humor in it. Most men did not stay long enough to understand why they should. He answered, and for the first time, there was something like respect in the space between them. Not spoken, not acknowledged, but present all the same. The leading figure in the distance slowed slightly, the rest following without question, their line tightening, their purpose becoming clearer with every step. Ethan did not reach for anything, did not prepare in any visible way. He simply stood there, grounded, as if the land beneath him was enough. Clara shifted half a step forward, placing herself not in front of him, not behind him, but aligned with him. Her presence no longer a barrier, but a shared line drawn without stakes or words. The first light of dawn began to touch the horizon, faint and pale, stretching thin across the sky, revealing more of what approached, and in that growing light, it became clear that whatever was coming was not chaos, not disorder, but something measured, something that had come to see, to decide. And as the distance finally closed enough for their shapes to take form, Ethan did not move, Clara did not speak, and the land between them held steady, waiting for the moment when silence would no longer be enough. The first rider reached the edge of the open ground just as the light of dawn stretched fully across the valley, pale gold brushing against dust and silence, and everything seemed to slow. In that moment, not because time had changed, but because every movement now carried weight, Ethan Cole did not step forward, did not step back. He remained exactly where he stood beside Clara Whitlock, his shoulders relaxed, his gaze steady, not challenging, not yielding, just present in a way that made it clear he was not passing through anymore. The line of riders came to a stop without a word, their formation tightening with quiet precision, no one reaching for anything, no one breaking the stillness that had settled between them. Clara's eyes moved across them one by one, recognizing patterns instead of faces, recognizing intention instead of threat, and she gave the smallest nod, not to greet, not to submit, but to acknowledge that they had arrived as expected. The lead figure shifted slightly in the saddle, their posture straight, measured, their attention settling on the ground just beyond Ethan, where the small marker stood alone beside the rise. And for a moment, that was all that mattered. Not the people, not the tension, just that simple piece of wood placed where it needed to be. Ethan noticed it too, the way their focus did not land on him, but on what he had chosen to protect, and something in his expression eased, not relief, but understanding that he had not misread the moment. Clara took one step forward then, slow, deliberate, her boots pressing into the earth with quiet certainty, placing herself just ahead of Ethan, but not separating from him, her voice steady when she finally spoke. "This land remains as it was," she said, and there was no need to explain further, because the truth of it stood behind her in the form of that marker, in the absence of stakes, in the quiet space that had been returned to what it once was. The lead rider tilted their head slightly, studying the ground, the marker, the two figures standing there without division, and then their gaze shifted to Ethan, not sharp, not questioning, just observing, as if measuring something that could not be seen from a distance. Ethan met that gaze without hesitation, not asserting himself, not defending anything, simply standing in the place he had chosen with nothing hidden. The silence stretched again, but it was different now, not tense, not uncertain, but full, like something had already been decided and only needed to be acknowledged. The wind moved lightly through the valley, lifting dust in thin lines that drifted past boots and hooves alike. And in that quiet motion, the lead rider gave a single, slow nod, small enough that it could be missed if someone was not watching closely. Clara saw it, her shoulders settling just a fraction, the kind of release that came. When a long-held weight finally shifted, Ethan did not move, did not react outwardly, but his breath deepened slightly, steady, grounded. The riders did not advance further, did not speak. They simply remained there for a moment longer, as if honoring something unseen, something older than any of them. And then, without signal or sound, they began to turn, one by one, their lines shifting with the same quiet precision they had arrived with, moving away from the valley, from the rise, from the marker that now stood undisturbed. Clara watched them go, her eyes following until they became shapes again, then shadows, then nothing at all. And only when the land returned to stillness did she glance back toward Ethan, not with suspicion, not with challenge, but with something quieter, something that had not been there before. And though she did not speak, the space between them had changed in a way that no words could have carried. The valley did not rush back to life after the riders disappeared. It stayed quiet, almost too quiet, like the land itself was holding on to what had just passed through it. And Ethan Cole remained where he stood for a moment longer than necessary, his eyes still fixed on the horizon where the last trace of movement had vanished, as if making sure it was real before allowing himself to move again. Clara Whitlock turned first, not abruptly, not with relief, just with a slow shift of weight that marked the end of something that had been waiting for years, her gaze drifting back toward the small rise, toward the single marker now standing where it belonged. And for a brief moment, her hand lifted slightly, not touching it, not needing to, just acknowledging it the way one does when something has been set right without being spoken. Ethan finally exhaled, a breath that had been held longer than he realized, and stepped back from the place where he had stood beside her, not retreating, not leaving, just giving the space back to what it was before he arrived, his boots pressing lightly into the dirt as he moved toward what remained of his camp, the fire now reduced to faint ash, the scattered pieces of wood from the stakes lying where he had dropped them, no longer forming a line, no longer meaning anything on their own. Clara watched him for a moment, her expression unreadable, not guarded, not open, just considering, as if trying to understand what kind of man chose to undo his own claim without being forced to. Most men would have waited until they were told, she said quietly, her voice carrying across the short distance between them. Ethan crouched near the remnants of the fire, brushing a bit of ash aside with the side of his hand. Not to rebuild it, just to clear it, to leave no mark stronger than it needed to be. Most men would not have stayed long enough to hear it, he replied. And again, there was no edge to his words, just a simple truth that did not ask to be agreed with. Clara stepped closer then, stopping near the edge of where his camp had been, her eyes tracing the ground, noting what had changed and what had not, the absence of stakes, the quiet respect left behind in their place, the way the marker stood, alone but no longer unprotected. You could still leave, she said, not as a command, not as a warning, but as an option she felt she had to give. Ethan straightened slowly, his hands resting loosely at his sides, his gaze meeting hers without hesitation. I could, he said, and for a second, it sounded like he might, like the road was still calling him the way it always had. But he did not turn, did not reach for his horse. Instead he glanced past her, back toward the rise, toward the marker, that now held more meaning than any land he had ever crossed. But I am not in a hurry anymore, he added, and something in the way he said it settled into the space between them, quiet but firm. Clara studied him again, longer this time, not searching for weakness, not testing him, but trying to understand the shape of a man who did not act the way the world had taught her to expect. The wind moved gently through the valley now, carrying none of the tension from before, just the soft sound of grass shifting and the faint creak of leather from the horses behind them. And for the first time since he arrived, the land did not feel divided, it felt shared, not owned, not claimed, just held by those willing to stand for it. Clara let out a slow breath, her shoulders easing in a way that was almost imperceptible, and though she did not smile, there was a quiet change in her presence, a space opening where before there had only been distance. Then you stay, she said simply, not asking, not confirming, just accepting what had already been decided. And Ethan gave a small nod, not to her, not to himself, but to the land around them, as if acknowledging that for once, He was not just passing through, and the valley, still and steady, seemed to accept it without question. The days that followed did not arrive with noise or change. They slipped in quietly, one after another, as if the valley had decided that nothing needed to be proven anymore. And Ethan Cole moved through them without hurry, his presence no longer foreign to the land, but not fully claimed either. He repaired what little he had disturbed, not building a camp this time, not drawing lines, just setting things in place with a care that did not ask for recognition. The small marker by the rise remained untouched, standing alone in the open. But now there were subtle signs around it. Stones placed with intention, the ground smoothed where footsteps once lingered too long. Clara Whitlock noticed everything. Even when she said nothing, her watchful silence no longer sharp, but steady, like the edge of a blade that no longer needed to be drawn. One morning, as the light spread thin across the valley, she found Ethan near the edge of the rise, not standing over it, not guarding it, just working a few feet away, his hands clearing brush that had begun to creep too close, careful not to disturb the soil itself. "You are doing more than staying," she said, her voice carrying lightly across the space between them. Ethan did not stop what he was doing. He brushed the last bit of dry grass aside before straightening, wiping his hands against his coat without looking at her. "Staying is easier when you know where not to step," he replied, and there was something in the way he said it that felt earned, not learned. Clara stepped closer, her boots pressing into the dirt with the same quiet certainty she always carried, her gaze moving from him to the marker, to the ground that held stories no one else had waited to hear. "Most people only learn that after they have already taken too much," she said, not accusing, not praising, just stating what the land had shown her over time. Ethan nodded once, his eyes following hers, not trying to see what lay beneath, but acknowledging that it was there, that it mattered. The wind moved softly through the valley, carrying the faint scent of dust and something else, something calmer than before, and for the first time, it did not feel like a warning. It felt like a presence that had accepted what it found. Clara rested her hand lightly on the top of the marker, not holding it, not leaning on it, just touching it as if to confirm it was still there, still protected. "They will not come back," she said quietly, more to the land than to him. Ethan glanced toward the distant ridge, where the riders had once appeared, and then back to the ground beneath them. "No," he said. They saw enough, and there was no pride in it, no claim, just a simple understanding of what had passed between silence and action. Clara let her hand fall back to her side, her shoulders easing in a way that no one else would notice, but Ethan did, because he had learned to pay attention to the things that were not said. The valley stretched out around them, unchanged in shape, but different in weight, no longer divided by lines that did not belong, no longer waiting for someone to decide its worth. And as the sun climbed higher, casting clear light across every inch of open ground, Ethan stepped back from the rise once more, giving it the space it had always deserved, while Clara remained beside it, not alone this time, but not needing to say anything about it either, because some things, once understood, did not need to be spoken again. The sun climbed higher each day, steady and unbothered, casting long, honest light across the valley as if nothing had ever been disputed there, and Ethan Cole settled into a rhythm that did not belong to ownership but to presence. He worked the edges of the land without crossing into what he had learned to respect, fixing a broken fence line far from the rise, drawing water from a shallow stream that bent away from the marked ground, never once stepping where he no longer had a right to stand. And Clara Whitlock watched it all without making a show of it, her movements still deliberate, still quiet, but no longer circling him like a question waiting to be answered. One afternoon, as the heat pressed down and the air carried that dry, familiar scent of sun-warmed earth, she found him near the far side of the valley, kneeling beside a patch of ground where grass had begun to thin, his hands working slowly, pressing small stones into place to guide the flow of water back toward the roots, not claiming it, just helping it find its way again. "You fix things that are not yours," she said, her voice carrying across the open space, not sharp, not doubtful, just noticing. Ethan glanced up briefly, shielding his eyes from the light with the edge of his hand. "Some things are not meant to be owned," he replied, and then returned to his work. the simplicity of it settling between them like something that had always been true but rarely spoken. Clara stepped closer, her boots leaving faint impressions in the dry soil, her gaze moving from his hands to the small adjustments he had made. The way the water now shifted slightly, finding a path that would keep the ground alive longer. Most men take what they can and leave the rest to fail, she said, and there was no bitterness in her tone, just the weight of having seen it too many times. Ethan pressed the last stone into place and leaned back slightly, studying the line he had shaped. Most men are in a hurry, he said quietly. They think leaving is the same as moving forward. Clara considered that, her eyes drifting across the valley, taking in the land that had once felt like a boundary and now felt like something steadier, something shared without being spoken. The wind moved through again, softer now, carrying none of the warning it once held, just the quiet sound of grass bending and returning. Ethan stood slowly, brushing his hands against his coat, and for a moment, neither of them spoke, because there was nothing left that needed to be said to explain what had already been understood. Clara turned toward the rise then, her steps unhurried, her path familiar, and Ethan did not follow. He stayed where he was, giving the distance without being told, respecting the line that no longer needed to be drawn. And as she reached the marker, she paused, her hand resting lightly against the wood, feeling the grain beneath her fingers, steady, unchanged, protected. She looked back. Once, not searching, not questioning, just acknowledging the man who had chosen to stand without taking. And Ethan met that glance with the same quiet steadiness he had carried from the beginning. No claim, no expectation, just presence. And in that moment, the valley held them both without division, without conflict, as if the land itself had decided that what mattered was not who stayed or who left, but how they chose to stand while they were there. The sky turned a softer shade toward evening, stretching long bands of light across the valley, and the land seemed to breathe slower under it, steady and untroubled, as if it had settled into a rhythm that no longer needed to prove itself. And Ethan Cole stood near the far edge where the water he had guided now flowed more evenly, his hands resting at his sides, not working, just watching the way it moved, the way it held its path without forcing anything around it. And Clara Whitlock approached from the rise, her steps quiet but certain, the same as they had always been, though something in her presence carried less distance now, less need to stand apart. She stopped a few feet from him, her eyes following the water instead of him. "Holds," she said, her voice low, almost thoughtful, and Ethan nodded once, his gaze still on the slow current. "It will, as long as no one tries to make it go somewhere else," he replied, and the words settled into the space between them with a quiet weight that felt larger than the moment itself. Clara shifted slightly, her boots pressing into the ground that had once felt like something she alone had to protect, and now felt like something that could stand with or without her. "You talk like you have seen things fall apart before," she said, not probing, just noticing. Ethan let out a slow breath, his eyes lifting toward the distant hills where the light was beginning to fade. "I have seen what happens when people believe something belongs to them more than it belongs to itself," he said, and there was no bitterness in it, just a calm recognition that came from having lived it. Clara studied him then, really studied him, not as a stranger anymore, not as someone to measure against the land, but as a man who had chosen to stay without taking, and that made him harder to understand than anything else she had known. The wind moved gently through the valley, carrying with it the soft sound of grass brushing against itself, and for a moment, everything felt still in a way that did not ask for anything more. "You never told me why you came here," she said after a while, her voice steady, not demanding, just opening a door that had been closed since the beginning. Ethan did not answer right away, his gaze drifting back toward the rise, toward the marker that stood quiet and unchanged. And when he spoke, his voice was lower, not guarded, but careful. "I was looking for a place that did not need anything from me," he said, and the honesty of it lingered in the air, simple and complete. Clara let that sit for a moment, her eyes moving once more across the land, across the water, across the space that now held both of them without tension. "And you found one that needed you to leave," she said softly, not as a contradiction, but as a truth that had shaped everything that followed. Ethan gave a small nod, his expression unchanged. "I almost did not listen," he admitted. And there was no shame in it, just acknowledgement. Clara's gaze softened just a fraction, not in kindness, but in understanding, the kind that comes when someone recognizes the edge they once stood on themselves. The light continued to fade, pulling the colors of the valley into deeper tones, and neither of them moved to leave, because leaving was no longer the question. The land stretched out around them, quiet and whole, and in that quiet, something else settled, something unspoken, not a promise, not a bond, but a shared understanding that neither of them would have chosen, and yet both had accepted. And as the first shadows of evening returned, the valley held them in that stillness, unchanged, but no longer the same. The night returned with a quieter weight than before, not heavy with warning, but full in a way that made every small sound feel deliberate. And Ethan Cole sat near the edge of the valley, not by a fire this time, but beside the low line of stones he had set to guide the water, his hands resting loosely in his lap, his gaze moving between the faint shimmer of the stream and the dark outline of the rise in the distance. Clara Whitlock stood there again, as she always did when the light began to fall, her figure steady against the fading sky, her presence no longer a barrier but something rooted, something that belonged without needing to claim it. And for a long while neither of them spoke, because the silence between them had become something they both understood, something that did not need to be filled. The wind carried a softer sound now, the kind that moved through grass instead of against it, and somewhere far beyond the ridge, a faint echo rolled across the land again, not sharp, not immediate, but familiar enough to be noticed. Ethan lifted his head slightly, listening, not tense, not alert in the way he had been before, just aware. Clara did not turn, did not shift. She had already heard it, already measured it. "Not the same as before," she said quietly, her voice steady, not concerned. Ethan nodded once, his eyes tracing the horizon where darkness met what little light remained. "No," he replied, "this one is passing through," and there was something in the way he said it that carried a quiet certainty, as if he had learned to read the land in the same way she had, not through signs alone, but through the absence of them. Clara stepped away from the marker then, her boots pressing into the ground with that same unhurried confidence. And for the first time, she did not stop at the rise. She continued down toward him, closing the distance without hesitation, stopping a few feet away, not guarding, not watching, just standing there as someone who no longer needed to measure every step. "You hear it differently now," she said, not asking, just noticing. Ethan gave a small breath that almost passed for a quiet acknowledgement. "I stopped trying to decide what it means for me," he said, and started listening to what it means for the land. Clara's gaze lingered on him for a moment longer than usual, not searching, not testing, but recognizing something she had not expected to find, the kind of change that does not come from being told, but from choosing to stay long enough to understand. The wind moved again, brushing past them both, carrying with it that faint echo as it faded further into the distance, and neither of them turned to follow it, because they both knew it was not meant for them. The valley remained still, the marker standing quiet, the water moving in its guided path, everything holding as it should. Clara lowered her gaze briefly to the ground between them, then back up, her voice softer now, though no less certain. "You are not passing through anymore," she said, and it was not a question. Ethan did not answer right away, his eyes moving once more across the land, across the rise, across the space that had once felt divided and now felt whole. And when he finally spoke, his voice carried the same calm weight it always had, but with something settled beneath it. "No," he said, and that was enough. The silence returned again, but it was no longer empty. It was filled with something steady, something that did not need to be proven. And as the night deepened, the valley held them both without question, without conflict, as if it had already decided they belonged there, not as owners, not as strangers, but as part of what remained. The dawn came slowly on the final morning, not with brilliance, but with a quiet kind of certainty, the kind that settles over a place that has nothing left to prove. And Ethan Cole was already awake, standing near the edge of the rise, not close enough to disturb it, not far enough to ignore it, his hat resting low against the soft light, his eyes moving across the valley as if memorizing something he had not known he was searching for. The marker stood where it always had, unchanged, but no longer alone. The ground around it held a different weight now, not guarded by force, not protected by fear, but kept by something quieter, something steadier. Clara Whitlock approached from behind, her steps as measured as they had been on the first day, but no longer distant, no longer testing. She stopped beside him without a word, her gaze following his across the land that had once divided them, and for a moment, neither of them spoke, because the silence had become something they both understood, something that carried more meaning than anything they could say. The wind moved gently through the valley, brushing past the grass, the stones, the water that now flowed where it needed to, and it did not carry warning, it carried memory, the kind that lingers without asking to be held. Ethan reached into his coat slowly, not in haste, not with purpose that needed to be explained, and when his hand came back out, he held a small object, worn, simple, a piece of metal that caught the light just enough to be seen. Clara glanced at it, her expression steady, not questioning, just waiting. Ethan stepped forward, careful, stopping just short of the rise, and he knelt, not out of obligation, not out of ritual, but because it felt like the only way to meet the ground without standing over it. He pressed the object into the soil beside the marker, not deep, not hidden, just enough to leave it there, to let it remain. Clara watched without speaking, her eyes following the motion, the quiet intention behind it, and when he stood again, he did not explain, did not look for acknowledgement. He simply stepped back, returning to where he had stood before. "You are leaving something behind," she said softly.